The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like 1,000 cicadas locked in glass. Dr. Sterling had built something at Mercy General, not just a reputation, but an empire. A careful empire. Profitable. The kind that required constant supervision, constant control, constant erasure of anyone who might notice the gaps between what the billing said and what actually happened. She moved through the emergency department like smoke. Nobody really saw her? That was the point. That was exactly the point. Sarah Chen arrived for the night shift at 11:47 p.m., her badge clipped to the pocket of blue scrubs that had been washed so many times the fabric felt like skin. The ER doors slid open. The smell of antiseptic and stale coffee hit first, led beneath something metallic, dried blood, old sweat, the particular funk of fluorescent-lit spaces where humans leaked into tile. She didn't flinch. The sensory chaos was just data. Boots on the tile floor. 1, 2, 3, 4. Steady rhythm. The kind of gait that came from somewhere else, somewhere distant, somewhere with real consequences for hesitation. The night shift at Mercy General had its own architecture. The acute trauma bays clustered on the east wing where the ventilators wheezed their mechanical rhythm and the cardiac monitors beeped their endless metronome. The intermediate care unit where patients recovered in staged intervals, their vital signs slowly drifting toward stability or collapse depending on which way the body decided to vote. The administrative offices, dark now at this hour except for Sterling's light, always on, always burning behind that glass partition like a malevolent beacon. He didn't trust anyone else with the books. He handled the billing codes himself. He reviewed the charts himself. He made the calls to the insurance companies himself. Control was the only thing that kept the machine running. Sarah signed into the system and pulled her assignment. 8 patients. Trauma Bay 2 held a Marine commander named Hayes recovering from shrapnel fragmentation wound sustained in Kandahar province 3 weeks prior. Orthopedic repair was stable. The chest wounds were healing. Routine monitoring, vital signs, for management, dressing changes. The kind of work that required attention to detail and an absolute refusal to miss the small changes that preceded the large ones. The tiny shift in respiration. The subtle change in skin color. The way a monitor trace could flatten from healthy to catastrophic in the space between heartbeats. She pulled his chart and read the history. Hayes had been extracted by Medevac, transferred through Bagram to Germany, stabilized at Walter Reed, and then transferred to Mercy General for the extended recovery phase. 39 years old. 2 tours in Helmand Province. Current rank, Commander in the United States Marine Corps. Medals listed but not described, the paperwork simply noted commendations without elaboration. She recognized the pattern. The kind of service record that got edited before civilians saw it. The night shift was different from day shift. The hospital became something else after dark. The chaos diminished. The families went home. The visiting hours closed at 8. What remained was the core, the nurses and techs and doctors who could function in the reduced light, the ones who understood that hospitals were not healing places at night. They were survival machines. You went into one at 2 in the morning, you came out changed, or you didn't come out at all. Sarah moved through her opening rounds with the efficiency of someone who had done this 10,000 times. Not a nurse going through motions. A machine calibrated for precision. She checked the 4 lines, 18-gauge peripheral in the left forearm, already 2 hours old, sight clean, no infiltration. She reviewed the cardiac monitor trace. She verified the medication schedule. She assessed pain levels and dressing integrity. Each action flowed into the next like a choreography no one had taught her because her hands knew it through muscle memory older than her civilian credentials. The combat boots sat in her locker in the break room. She'd placed them there during her first week, pushed to the back behind spare compression socks and a uniform she kept for reasons she no longer examined. The boots were the only thing from before. Everything else had been stripped away. The dog tag she'd surrendered during processing. The unit patches she'd cut from her jackets. The photographs. The letters. The names of people she'd trained with, served with, lost. All of it gone except the boots, scuffed leather the color of dried blood, treads worn down from 1,000 patrols through terrain that tried to kill you in 17 different ways. They were decommissioned. Useless. She kept them anyway. Dr. Sterling arrived at 1:13 a.m. for rounds. His presence changed the air pressure in the unit. Not because he was loud, he wasn't loud. He was worse. He was precise. Everything about him communicated absolute authority held in absolute check, like a blade kept so sharp it could cut without even touching you. Expensive watch. Tailored shirt. The kind of composure that came from knowing everyone around you depended on your approval for their next paycheck. He moved through Trauma Bay 2 where Hayes was sleeping, the commander's chest rising and falling on its own, the shrapnel wound sealed under sterile dressing. Sterling reviewed the chart without speaking. His eyes moved across the vital signs, the medication log, Sarah's nursing notes with their precise documentation and careful attention to every parameter. He didn't look up at her. Not directly. But something in his posture shifted. Attention that hadn't been there. Impressive charting. His voice was soft. Conversational. The kind of tone that made you wait for the other shoe. Very thorough. Almost meticulous. Standard documentation, Doctor. Standard. He closed the chart. Tell me, how long have you been in nursing? 12 years, Doctor. He turned to look at her directly then. His gaze was the color of a stormy Atlantic and twice as cold. 12 years. That's a long time to be invisible. You'd think someone with that much experience would have moved into management by now. Charge nurse positions. Supervisory roles. But you haven't. You're content to stay in the trenches. Why is that? I prefer direct patient care. Do you? It wasn't a question. Sterling replaced the chart in its slot with the precision of someone filing away secrets. Keep up the thorough documentation. We're implementing new billing compliance protocols. The insurance companies are looking more closely at our coding now. Everything needs to be perfectly documented. Perfectly aligned. Perfectly. He paused. Justified. He left the bay. Sarah stood perfectly still. The monitor beeped twice. Sinus rhythm. The heart following its electrical script, unaware that everything above it was negotiating the terms of its own survival. Hayes woke during Sarah's 2 a.m. vitals check. His eyes came open all at once, not the gradual surfacing of normal sleep, but the snapping awake of someone whose nervous system had been calibrated by deployments. His hand moved toward the fall line before he was fully conscious. It's secure. Don't pull it. His focus shifted to her. Something changed in his expression. Something like recognition, but filtered through medication and exhaustion and the fog of pain management. You move different than the day nurses. Different how? Like you know what you're doing. His voice was rough from the intubation tube they'd pulled out 3 days prior. Like you've done this before. I've done this many times. He studied her face. A full 3 seconds. The kind of assessment that suggested he was running comparisons, matching current data against archived memory. Then he closed his eyes again. Okay. Thank you. She adjusted his morphine drip. Checked the saline flow. Made the notes. By 3 a.m. the unit had settled into that particular silence that only came in the deep night, not the absence of sound, but the presence of something heavier. Anticipation. The feeling before something changed. But that wasn't the worst part. At 3:38 a.m., Sterling's light was still on in his office. Sarah saw it through the window as she passed. He was at his computer, not reviewing charts now. His fingers moved across the keyboard with rhythmic precision. Creating something. Building something. She didn't know what. She didn't want to know. But she had learned in 12 years of military service that when command got focused like that, when command stopped making noise and started working quietly in the background, someone's world was about to collapse. Usually, that someone was standing right next to the man who was doing the collapsing. She had 3 more hours until day shift arrived. 3 more hours until the hospital woke up and the machinery that ran on darkness had to shift gears and pretend to be something it wasn't. 3 hours was enough time for a lot of things to happen. But as she turned back toward the ward, toward Hayes and his stable vitals and his strange moment of recognition, she still didn't understand what was about to unfold. None of them did. Sarah moved through the corridors of Mercy General with the same quiet efficiency she'd perfected across 2 decades, checking vitals on the commander in Bay 3, her hand steady as she positioned the fall line. The needle slid in on the first attempt, textbook placement, minimal discomfort. His family sat in chairs pushed against the wall, watching her work with the kind of gratitude that made her look away. That's when Dr. Sterling walked in. He was 43, legacy money threaded through his surname like gold leaf, the kind of man who'd never been told no by anyone who mattered. His presence occupied space the way arrogance does, taking up more air than it earned. He moved to the commander's bedside without acknowledging Sarah, then turned to face her as if she'd just materialized. "This is our hospitalist approach," Sterling said, his voice carrying the practiced condescension of a man lecturing children. He gestured toward the fall line. "Though I'm not sure why we're trusting critical placements to someone without formal training." Sarah's jaw tightened. One breath. Measured. She said nothing. "You know, I was reviewing the intake protocols," Sterling continued, speaking now to the commander's wife as if Sarah couldn't hear him. "Some nurses, well, some people in nursing roles, they develop habits. Bad habits. Dangerous deviations from procedure." He smiled at the family. "Just something I've noticed lately." The commander's daughter, 24 years old with her father's sharp eyes, watched Sarah's face. Sarah didn't move. Didn't blink. The tear that escaped was so small it might have been a trick of the fluorescent lights, but she wiped it with one steady finger and looked directly at Sterling. "The 4 is patent," she said quietly. "Blood draws are back. His orders are in the system." It wasn't enough to satisfy him. Sterling was already moving out of the room, already planning the next approach, already certain he'd landed something that would stick. By 11 p.m., the break room had become a place Sarah no longer entered. She'd sat down with her coffee at midnight, and within 90 seconds the room had evacuated like she'd triggered a fire alarm. Martinez left first, then Johnson. The night charge nurse, Chen, no relation, exchanged a look with the others and followed them out. Sarah had sat there for exactly 3 minutes before understanding. The word had spread. Under review. Dangerous deviations. Someone said Sterling was considering a report to the state board. Sarah finished her coffee alone, watching rain hammer the windows in a rhythm like applause. The break room smelled like burnt coffee and industrial cleaner. She could see her reflection in the dark glass, fractured and incomplete. At 2:17 a.m., Sterling appeared in the hallway outside the nurse's station with a clipboard and a smile that belonged on a predator. He'd printed something, a disciplinary write-up, formal letterhead, her name at the top in bold. He pinned it to the bulletin board next to the staff announcements and the OSHA notices, then left it there. Sarah watched him do it from 30 feet away. Watched him straighten the paper. Watched him check his phone as if he'd just accomplished something important. The write-up cited dangerous deviations from protocol in the placement and monitoring of for-access devices and failure to document adherence to unit safety standards. Every sentence was carefully constructed to be technically unprovable. Every word was designed to wound. Staff filtered past the board over the next hour. They read it. They looked at Sarah. Some looked away quickly. A few held her gaze a beat too long, the kind of look that meant pity. Sarah felt the weight of 37 pairs of eyes on her across the night, and she absorbed each one the way the desert absorbs rain, completely, without resistance. She was finishing a chart at 3:44 a.m. when the commander's voice came from Bay 3, low enough that no one else would hear it. "Marjah, 2010, he whispered. "You were the medic. North perimeter. IED took out the whole northern gate and you came through the dust, just came through it like it was nothing, and you held the line until medevac. Sarah's hand stopped moving. She looked at him, really looked at him. His eyes were clear, lucid. The medication he was on wouldn't have him confused. The scar along his left jaw caught the light. The way he was looking at her meant recognition. Real recognition. Not a guess. She pressed one finger to her lips. A single gesture. Not a sound. Not a confirmation. Just a request for silence, for discretion, for the kind of operational security that transcended decades and uniforms and everything that had happened between then and now. The commander understood immediately. He nodded once and looked away, closed his eyes as if sleep had suddenly claimed him, left the secret there between them in the darkness of Bay 3 like an unexploded ordnance both of them knew to leave undisturbed. Sarah's pulse had climbed to somewhere dangerous. Her hands were steady but her mind was running tactical calculations. Who else had recognized her? How long did she have? How had Sterling known to push now, of all moments, when the one person who could expose her entire fabricated existence was lying in the hospital she was slowly being forced out of? She returned to her charting, but the numbers on the screen had stopped making sense. Somewhere in the hospital, Dr. Sterling was already making calls. She could feel it the way she'd once felt incoming fire on a distant ridge. She didn't know the specifics yet. She only knew that the walls of her civilian life, so carefully constructed over 18 months, had developed the first visible cracks. The night shift tilted on its axis at 2:06 a.m. Commander Hayes' monitor began to sing a different song. The rhythm changed first, heart rate climbing from 94 to 118 to 142. Then the blood pressure started its collapse. 156 over 92. 148 over 88. 134 over 76. Sarah noticed it from the supply closet where she'd been restocking for lines, the kind of observation that came from muscle memory built across 2 tours in Marjah, where noticing meant the difference between walking out of a phi base and being carried out. She set down the packages and moved toward his room without hurrying. Hurrying was the mistake people made. Hurrying meant panic. Panic meant mistakes. The stretcher wheel squeaked as she approached the recovery bay where the commander lay sleeping, his chest rising and falling beneath the monitoring leads that traced his heart story across the screen in amber waves. His skin had taken on a waxy quality in the past hour, not the healthy pallor of post-operative rest, but something else. Something wrong. Sarah moved closer and her fingers found his carotid pulse before she checked the monitor. Thready. Fast. The kind of pulse that meant his body was compensating for something deeper. She checked his eyes. The conjunctiva had a faint venous distension. His neck veins stood like cables. "We need to call Dr. Sterling," she said, her voice steady, reaching for the phone at the bedside station. The words came out as observation, not alarm. The commander is showing signs of tamponade. The night resident, a third-year named Morrison who'd trained under Sterling's exact brand of condescension, glanced at the monitor. Blood pressure's a little low. Probably just post-operative. Hayes is stable. His heart rate is 142. Sarah said. His JVD is elevated. His skin is cool and his pulse is already. Decreased cardiac output. Classic presentation. I said he's stable. Morrison didn't look away from his phone. Dr. Sterling will be here in the morning for rounds. We'll monitor. Sarah felt the familiar weight of being right and powerless. She'd carried this weight before, in Sanjin Valley when a corpsman insisted a casualty could wait 20 minutes for evac and the casualty's bleeding became something irreversible. In FOB Shank when a lieutenant refused to change the patrol route despite her assessment of IED placement patterns. She knew the shape of being unheard. It was a shape she'd learned to wear like body armor. The alarm accelerated at 2:13 a.m. The monitor's rhythm began to deteriorate, the rate climbing past 160, the blood pressure dropping through 100 systolic. Sarah was already moving, her hands reaching for the emergency cart that sat in the alcove near the station. She grabbed the crash cart phone and dialed. "This is Trauma Bay C. I need Dr. Sterling." Code. Now. He's in the physician's lounge. I'll. Now. The word came out different. It was a command, not a request. The voice of someone accustomed to being obeyed by people with significantly more authority than a hospital administrator. Sarah didn't notice the change. She was already at the commander's bedside, her fingers on his radial pulse, weak, thready, fading. Shock. His body was bleeding internally somewhere. The surgery 3 hours earlier had been routine, exploration and closure of shrapnel wounds from an IED blast that had happened 8 years ago. Routine. Except nothing about the human body was routine once it started failing. "Get me a 16-gauge for access," Sarah said. "And someone get me a POCUS machine." Morrison was staring at her. "You can't. Do it." Sarah's eyes had gone flat. The eyes of someone who'd made these decisions before and watched people die when they weren't made. "And call cardiothoracic. Now." The monitor showed the worst rhythm now, the telltale electrical dissociation that meant the heart was no longer coordinating its contractions with anything meaningful. Pulseless electrical activity. The kind of rhythm that meant blood had stopped flowing and the window for intervention was narrowing in real time. Dr. Sterling arrived at 2:17 a.m., still fastening his white coat, his expression already arranged into irritation before he even saw the patient. "What's the crisis? I was informed this was stable." Sarah was standing at the bedside with the ultrasound probe in her hands. She'd performed the focused cardiac ultrasound scan in 40 seconds. The pericardium showed what she already knew. Fluid. Blood. Massive effusion compressing the chambers. "Cardiac tamponade," she said, not looking at Sterling. "Pericardial fluid is restricting ventricular filling. Heart rate compensating. Now decompensating." "Step back," Sterling said. He moved to the monitor and studied it with the expression of a man trying to understand something written in a language he'd never learned. "Okay. Let's get him on pressers. Push a liter of normal saline wide open." "That will make it worse," Sarah said quietly. The voice was conversational. Respectful even. "Increasing preload on a tamponade case decreases cardiac output further. He needs decompression. He needs a pericardiocentesis." Sterling turned to her. His face was red now. "I am aware of the basic treatment protocol, nurse. I don't need a staff nurse instructing me on cardiology." "No, sir. But he needs this procedure in the next." Sarah glanced at the monitor, tracked the blood pressure reading at 68 systolic and falling, did the math that medics do with their hands steady and their voices calm, approximately 3 minutes. After that, cardiogenic shock becomes irreversible. The night staff had begun to gather in the doorway, sensing something in the quality of the crisis, the kind of danger that pulled people from their routine tasks. Through the observation glass of the isolation room, they watched as Sterling continued to argue about protocol and as the commander's skin began to take on the grey quality of someone whose organs were being starved of blood. Sarah felt the shift happen inside her body, the moment when the civilian life dropped away like a costume. Her breathing changed. Her stance changed. The nurse who moved with careful deference transformed into something else entirely. When she spoke again, her voice had descended into a register that made several of the watching staff members step backward. "Doctor, I'm performing an emergency pericardiocentesis. Step aside." It wasn't a request. It was a command delivered by someone accustomed to operating under fire. The muscle memory of Marjah rose through her spine, the dusty forward operating base where she'd held a perimeter while shrapnel whistled overhead and her hands had performed medical miracles on people who would have died without them. Pain was information. Pain was data. But there was no time for pain here. There was only the needle and the fluid and the racing clock. She'd already opened the emergency tray. The needle was loaded, 14-gauge angiocath. She felt along the xiphoid process, the angle of the chest, located the pericardial space with the precision of someone who'd done this in darkness with mortars landing nearby. The skin felt warm under her fingers. The needle went in. The hiss came, the terrible relieved hiss of pressurized air and blood escaping from the sac that had been crushing the commander's heart. Sarah drew back on the syringe plunger and dark blood filled the barrel. 100 cc. 150. 200. The pressure releasing with each withdrawal. The monitor responded first. The rhythm began to stabilize. The electrical activity finding its way back toward something coherent. Then the numbers started climbing. The blood pressure rising. 74 systolic. 78, 82. 86, 90. 95, the heart rate dropping from the panicked 160s down to 118. 112, 105. The skin color beginning to pink back toward something human. Sarah held the position, the needle steady, her other hand controlling the syringe with the focus of someone operating in an environment where distraction meant casualties. "Get me a drainage catheter," she said. Not asking. Stating. And 12 cubic centimeters of normal saline for irrigation. One of the nurses moved without hesitation. Something in Sarah's voice had made every person in that room understand that this was not a moment for questions or hierarchy or protocol. This was a moment where the right person had to do the right thing at exactly the right moment. The drainage catheter was placed. The collection bag was positioned. The fluid continued to drain, serosanguinous drainage that indicated the bleeding had been steady but not catastrophic. The backup was just pressure. Just tamponade. Just the kind of thing that could kill someone in minutes if you didn't recognize it and didn't know exactly how to fix it. By 2:22 a.m., the commander's vital signs had stabilized into something that resembled normal human physiology again. His oxygen sat was 98%. His heart rhythm was clean sinus. His blood pressure was 116/74. Sarah withdrew her hands and stepped back. The observation room had gone absolutely silent. The night shift stood frozen in the doorway, watching a nurse whose hands had moved with surgical precision and whose voice had commanded authority they'd never heard before. Several of them were staring at her. One of them, a young LPN named Garcia, had her hand over her mouth. Sarah removed her gloves and disposed of them without looking at anyone. She documented the procedure in the chart with the clinical precision of someone trained to keep records that would stand up to military scrutiny. Time of intervention. Amount of fluid. Patient response. Vital signs trajectory. Dr. Sterling stood in the corner of the room, his mouth slightly open, his face the color of old marble. Sarah turned to him. One measured breath. Her eyes met his with the flatness of someone who had nothing left to lose because she'd never actually had anything to begin with. When she spoke, her voice was quiet enough that only he could hear it. "Don't ever get in the way of my patient again." Then she walked out of the isolation room and back into the fluorescent brightness of the emergency department. Her hands were completely steady. Her breathing was completely controlled. But in her chest, beneath the bone and muscle and all the careful Solilian construction, something had shifted irreversibly. The world had seen her. Just for 5 minutes, the world had watched her work, and now there was no going back to invisible. She didn't know that someone had taken a photo through the observation glass. She didn't know that at least 2 people in that room had recognized the poise of combat medicine performed under pressure. She didn't know that a phone call was being made in a quiet hallway to a number that had been disconnected officially 3 years ago. But she felt it. The crack in the wall. The first break in 18 months of perfectly constructed cover. As she walked to the break room to get a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago, she already knew the night wasn't over. It was only beginning. The monitor screamed its one-note warning as Commander Hayes's blood pressure collapsed like a building struck at its foundation. 118/70. 105/60. 90/50 and still dropping. Sarah moved through the observation window into the isolation room where he lay, his breathing shallow, his skin the color of wet concrete. The intern at the bedside stood frozen, hands suspended above the chart as if the pen might somehow reverse what was happening on the screen. "Call it," Sarah said. No question. No hesitation. 2 words that meant everything. Dr. Sterling materialized in the doorway behind her, his face tightening into something that resembled recognition. She was already reaching for the sterile field, her hands moving with the precision of muscle memory that predated this hospital, predated Houston, predated the life she'd constructed carefully over 18 months of invisible survival. The trauma shears from her pocket made a metallic whisper as she cut away the commander's gown. Ribs appeared. The space between them. The exact intercostal margin where 200 milliliters of blood was crushing the heart against the sternum like a fist closing around something fragile. "What are you doing?" Sterling's voice came from the doorway, pitched high. "You don't have authorization." Sarah wasn't listening anymore. The second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. Her fingers found the landmarks the way a musician's hands find keys they haven't touched in years. The needle was a 14-gauge angiocath, 30 millimeters of surgical steel, and it slid through the skin with the resistance of breaking through a membrane. She felt it, that precise moment of give when the needle penetrated the pericardial sac. The resistance changed. Everything changed. "You're exceeding your scope," Sterling screamed now, his voice bouncing off the tile like something trapped. "Stop this immediately." "That is an order." The first dark column of blood rose into the syringe. Venous return. Tamponade blood. The blood that had been suffocating the commander's heart with every beat. 60 cc. 100. 140. The monitor's frantic pace began to slow. 105 beats per minute. 100. 98. Sarah maintained steady pressure, her breathing synchronized with the procedure, not the commander's breathing, not the monitor's rhythm, but her own internal metronome, the one that had been calibrated through 3 tours in Marjah where you learned that panic was a luxury only people with backup ever afforded. 180 cc. 190. 200 cc of dark blood in the syringe now, and the commander's pressure began its climb like something waking from underwater. 98 over 60. 102 over 62. 110 over 70. The monitor's scream became a song, became something almost rational. And then the rhythm changed. The electrical chaos resolved into something clean, something organized, something that looked like what human hearts were supposed to do. "Sinus rhythm," the intern whispered, as if saying it aloud might break whatever spell had just been cast. The room went dead silent. Even Sterling's breathing seemed to stop. 23 staff members visible through the observation glass stood motionless, their eyes fixed on Sarah's steady hands, on the commander's face transitioning from the color of death back to something approximating life. The fluorescent lights hummed their endless electronic hymn above them. The ventilator wheezed. The 4 pumps ticked their measured beats. And Sarah completed the procedure with the same methodical precision that had characterized every medical intervention she'd ever performed, documenting vitals, securing the angiocath, monitoring the pressure readings, checking the pericardial fluid output with eyes that registered data the way radar registered targets. The next words out of Sterling's mouth came as if he was waking from a nightmare he couldn't quite remember. "You've exceeded your scope of practice. You violated protocol." This, he gestured wildly at the commander, at the syringe, at the monitor showing the steady march of a heartbeat that had nearly stopped. This was an authorized intervention. "You will stop working. Immediately." It wasn't a request. It was a command. Sarah looked at him. Not defiant. Not emotional. The kind of look a person gives you when they're translating something from a language you don't speak into words you'll never understand. She removed her badge from her neck. The plastic caught the light. The laminated photograph showed someone who looked like her but was missing something fundamental, some weight of knowledge behind the eyes. She set it on the medication cart next to a package of gauze and a bottle of antiseptic. The badge stayed there like something forgotten. "I need to be present for post-procedure monitoring," she said to the intern. Instructional. Professional. As if Sterling wasn't standing in the doorway at all. As if he'd already ceased to exist. Vital signs every 15 minutes for the first hour. Watch the pericardial output, anything over 50 cc per hour and we escalate. Page me if the pressure climbs again. The intern nodded, his eyes moving between Sarah and Sterling with the expression of someone watching two train tracks diverge. Sarah walked out of the trauma bay with the same economical movements that had carried her through 18 months at Mercy General, down the corridor, past the break room where staff parted like water around a stone, past the nursing station where her name had been erased from the assignment board before her shift even ended. She walked to her locker in the staff area behind the ER, where the air smelled like rubber and disinfectant and the particular staleness of a space that never saw sunlight. The locker was small. Hospital issue. She knew every dent in its surface, every scratch made by 300 other hands before hers touched the combination lock. Her jacket hung inside. A change of scrubs. A bottle of water from the break room refrigerator that no longer felt like a space she belonged in. And at the bottom, wrapped in a plastic grocery bag, the pair of worn combat boots. The leather was cracked from desert heat and monsoon rains. The laces were military-issue paracord that she'd replaced twice because the originals had deteriorated. They were the last physical object connecting her to a life that officially no longer existed. Security found her at 4:38 a.m. in the staff parking garage, sitting on the concrete step of a stairwell well, the rain falling on her shoulders in sheets that left her scrubs plastered to her skin. She'd been sitting there for 94 minutes, according to the text message Sterling had sent to hospital security, remove former nursing staff. Terminated for protocol violations. The security guard was young, maybe 24, with the expression of someone executing an order he didn't entirely understand. "I'm going to need you to come with me, he said. Sarah picked up the shopping bag containing the boots and stood. The rain hammered the concrete in a rhythm that sounded almost like applause. Or gunfire. Everything sounded like something else when you'd heard actual gunfire. She followed the security guard through the garage, past the vehicles with their rain-streaked windows, past the elevator bank where fluorescent light pooled like something chemical. He didn't touch her. He didn't need to. She went because the alternative was not going, and she'd spent 18 months perfecting the art of not drawing attention. The lobby of Mercy General at 5:15 a.m. was nearly empty. A family sat in the waiting area, the commander's family, Sarah realized. His wife with her hands folded in her lap. His son in a marine dress uniform, the creases still sharp enough to cut. His daughter reading something on her phone but not really reading it, just holding the screen in front of her face like armor. They saw her pass. The wife's eyes tracked her toward the exit, and something flickered across her expression, recognition, maybe, or the memory of a nurse who'd sat with them during the worst hours, who'd explained what tamponade meant, who'd held the oxygen mask at the right angle when the commander couldn't quite catch his breath. The rain outside was harder than it had seemed through the glass. It soaked through her jacket immediately. Her shoes, regular nursing shoes, the kind that squeaked on linoleum, filled with water. She walked for 6 blocks before finding a bus shelter, its plastic walls fogged with condensation and graffiti. She sat on the bench, the shopping bag containing her combat boots on her lap, and counted the cash in her wallet. $43. No. $38. She'd miscounted. Around her, the city of Houston was waking up, delivery trucks passing, a early morning jogger splashing through puddles, the distant wail of a siren that meant somebody else's crisis was just beginning. She pulled the boots from the bag. They were heavier than she remembered, or perhaps she was lighter. The leather had her scent still, dust and sunscreen and something else she couldn't quite name. She held them for a long time without moving. The rain continued. A stranger in a baseball cap appeared beneath the shelter, soaking wet, and offered her an umbrella. She shook her head and he moved on, confused by someone refusing shelter in a downpour. Her eyes burned. But soldiers don't cry. Her eyes burned and her hands trembled and her chest felt like something was collapsing inside it, but soldiers don't cry. She'd learned that the first time she packed a field hospital into a backpack and jumped out of a helicopter into territory that was supposed to kill her. The rain fell. The city woke up around her. Her phone had no signal in the bus shelter, or at least it registered no calls, no messages, nothing to suggest that anyone on Earth knew she still existed. She held the boots and thought about throwing them into the street, into the storm drain, into the garbage can next to the shelter where someone had left a coffee cup and a half-eaten donut. It would be easier. Disappearing completely would be simpler than this slow erasure, this being unmade one shift at a time. She could walk into a mall somewhere, buy new clothes, get a new name, become somebody else entirely. The Pentagon had done it before. They could do it again. And then, carrying across the wet morning with the quality of something impossible, she heard it. Distant at first, then unmistakable. The thud-thud-thud of helicopter rotors cutting through rain and dawn, and the sound of a city that still didn't know anything had changed. 3 of them. Flying low, their running lights visible through the clouds like something between stars and weapons. She stood, the boot still in her hands, and watched as they banked toward Mercy General Hospital 5 blocks away, moving with the precision of military aircraft on a military mission. The radio in the bus shelter crackled with dispatch chatter. Something about traffic control. Something about airspace. Something about a security situation at the hospital. Sarah stood motionless while the rotors grew louder, while the world compressed itself into a moment where everything she'd spent 18 months burying was about to wake up and walk through those hospital doors on its own terms, whether she was ready or not. The boots were still in her hands. She wasn't going to throw them away. The rain stopped at 6:06 a.m. Sarah sat in the waiting room of Houston VA Medical Center, 73 minutes after Dr. Sterling's security escort had walked her out through the emergency department. Her hands were steady. Her breathing controlled. The boots sat on the empty chair beside her, laces still threaded through the eyelets exactly as they had been when she'd carried them out of Mercy General's locker room, the leather creased from years of terrain that no longer had a name in her official existence. Around her, veterans occupied plastic chairs with the particular exhaustion of men and women who had learned to sleep anywhere, who knew the sound of monitors the way other people knew bird calls. A man missing his left forearm glanced at her. His eyes lingered. Not recognition exactly. Something older. The knowing look of someone who had stood in the same place between 2 worlds and found both doors locked. At 6:52 a.m., her phone rang. Unknown number. She answered without hesitation. The voice on the other end was Commander Hayes. His breath still carried the rasp of someone whose lungs had been recently traumatized, whose chest still ached with each full inhalation. "I'm calling my commanding officer," he said. 10 words. Each one a hammer strike. "I'm telling him everything. The firing. The setup. What you did. Who you are." Sarah said nothing. "You saved my life, Chief." "Not as a nurse. As a senior chief petty officer. And they're going to know it." The line went dead. She sat with the phone against her ear for another 4 seconds. Rain resumed, lighter this time, tapping against the windows like code. At 7:04 a.m., Dr. Sterling sat in his office at Mercy General, his desk phone pressed to his ear, his free hand shaking with the particular tremor that comes from suddenly understanding you have made a terrible calculation. He had already called 3 board members at home. He had already contacted the nursing schools where Sarah listed her references. He had already summoned hospital investigators to review 6 months of her procedures, searching for something, anything, that would justify what he had already decided, that Sarah Chen was dangerous, incompetent, reckless, beyond salvage. The investigators had found nothing. Not a single deviation. Not one procedure outside protocol. Her documentation was immaculate. Her patient outcomes were better than any nurse working nights at Mercy General. Her technical skill was beyond question. This was the problem. This was exactly the problem. At 7:18 a.m., Dr. Sterling called the hospital's chief administrator. Not a request. A demand. "I need you to finalize the termination paperwork," he said. "I need it done before 7:30. I need security to escort her out before the morning shift arrives." The administrator hesitated. On what grounds? Sterling's voice dropped. Scope of practice violation. Reckless endangerment. I have documentation. He did not have documentation. What he had was a reputation for being careful, for never moving without strategic cover, for understanding exactly how to weaponize institutional power. The administrator signed off. The paperwork was drawn up. Security was instructed. At 7:21 a.m., Sarah was called to the office. No explanation offered. The message delivered through an intercom by a nurse she had never humiliated, never corrected, never made feel small. She stood. The boots remained on the chair. She would not come back for them. Coming back would mean hope. Coming back would mean she believed this was temporary. She walked through corridors lined with staff who suddenly found reasons to look away, who realized with the weight of their silence that they had chosen wrong, that they had believed Sterling's whispers instead of believing her hands, her steady movements, her record of never letting anyone die on her watch if she could prevent it. The office was cold. The administrator would not meet her eyes. Sterling stood beside a file folder, and his expression carried the particular satisfaction of a man who had successfully orchestrated an erasure. Ms. Chen, your employment with Mercy General is terminated effective immediately. Your actions last night constituted a deliberate scope of practice violation and reckless endangerment of a patient. You performed an advanced procedure without authorization. You endangered lives. Sarah's jaw moved slightly. One breath. The kind of breath that comes from a place deeper than lungs. When she spoke, her voice carried a texture like a vault door closing. The patient lived. Sterling's eye twitched. Security will escort you from the premises. Sarah said nothing else. She turned and walked out. The boots were waiting in her locker. She placed them in a canvas bag along with her badge, her tablet, her personal items, the physical debris of a life she had constructed with precision over 18 months. The security guard stood 8 feet away, close enough to ensure compliance, far enough to maintain the fiction that this was routine. She zipped the bag. She did not look back. The parking lot was still wet from rain. Her car was parked in the nurse lot, 4th row. She placed the bag on the passenger seat. She sat in the driver's seat for exactly 90 seconds. Her hands did not shake. Her breathing did not accelerate. The trembling was happening somewhere far deeper, in a place they could not reach with security escorts or termination paperwork. At 7:59 a.m., she sat in the VA hospital waiting room. A nurse called her name at 8:04 a.m. Intake appointment. Routine screening. The intake nurse's eyes widened when she saw Sarah's medical history. The annotations. The classified redactions. The discharge summary that listed injuries and recovery timelines but provided no context for how she had received them. The nurse did not ask questions. Some records taught you that some stories belong to other people. At 8:18 a.m., a doctor came in. He was maybe 65, with the bearing of someone who had worn a uniform long enough that the posture never fully left, even after 30 years of civilian medicine. He sat down slowly. Senior Chief Petty Officer, he said quietly. Not a greeting. An acknowledgement. A naming of something that had been invisible until that moment. Sarah's expression did not change. I was at Landstuhl when you came through in 2010. You had shrapnel in your spine. They said you'd never walk straight again. He paused. You're walking straight, Chief. Sarah said, I'm just checking in. The doctor smiled sadly. No, you're not. You're disappearing. She said nothing. He left. 30 minutes later, she was back in the waiting room, boots still in the bag, and the weight of 18 months of silence pressing down like a physical thing. Then the phone started ringing. Not hers. The VA hospital's main line. And the hospital switchboard lit up like a grid going live. Calls coming in. Urgent calls. Military calls. The kind of calls that made administrators pale and security guards straighten. At 8:56 a.m., the hospital's chief of staff received a communication from headquarters, Marine Corps, in Arlington. It was not a request. It was not a question. It was a demand for immediate information regarding one Senior Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen and her location. The Chief of Staff did not understand. He called his emergency coordinator. They did not understand either. But they understood the authority in the voice on the other end of the line, and they began making calls of their own. Back at Mercy General, Dr. Sterling was finishing his 8 a.m. rounds when his secretary appeared in the doorway, her face the color of old snow. "Dr. Sterling, the hospital administrator needs you in his office immediately." Sterling assumed it was about something routine. Something administrative. He was wrong about everything at this point, though he did not yet fully understand the depth of his error. The administrator was not alone. The hospital's legal counsel sat beside him. And a federal agent stood by the window with the posture of someone trained to observe. "Dr. Sterling, we've been contacted by the Office of Naval Intelligence. They're asking about your interaction with one of our nurses. A Sarah Chen." Sterling's mouth went dry. She was a reckless employee who endangered a patient. "I terminated her this morning." The legal counsel leaned forward. "We've received records from Naval Medical Command indicating that this employee was performing emergency procedures at a standard that exceeds most trauma surgeons. We've also received notification that the Pentagon is opening an investigation into her termination." Sterling stood. "This is ridiculous. She violated protocol." The federal agent stepped forward. Her badge caught the fluorescent light. Her voice was quiet. "Dr. Sterling, we're also investigating billing discrepancies in your department totaling approximately $473,000 over the past 36 months. Would you like to explain those now, or would you prefer to do it with counsel present?" The room went very still. The kind of still that precedes collapse. Sterling's hand moved toward his desk, toward his computer. Toward the files. Toward the evidence. The federal agent's expression did not change. "Don't." One word. Everything he needed to understand. He sat back down. His breathing changed. The tremor in his hands became visible. "I was just managing the department," he said. His voice had lost its edge. It had become thin, papery, the voice of someone who had suddenly understood that he had miscalculated everything. "I was just," the administrator stood. "Your employment is suspended pending investigation. You will not access hospital systems. You will not contact staff. You will remain available for further questioning." Sterling tried to speak again. Nothing came out. His face had drained to the color of old bone. The agent was already on her phone. "We have confirmation." "Yes." "Attempting to access patient records." "Yes." "I see him. I'm right here." At the VA hospital, Sarah was still sitting in the waiting room when the administrator appeared in the doorway. Behind him stood a Marine colonel. Behind the colonel stood 2 additional Marines in dress uniforms. Behind them, visible through the glass doors, were 3 Black Hawk helicopters on the parking lot, rotors still turning, kicking up rain and debris into a vortex that rattled windows. The colonel's eyes scanned the waiting room and found her immediately. His bearing changed. His jaw tightened. He walked directly toward her with the kind of precision that cleared space around him. When he was 3 feet away, he saluted. Not a casual gesture. A full, formal salute. His voice carried the weight of command authority. "Senior Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen. I'm Colonel James Hartford, 2nd Marine Expeditionary Force. I'm here on orders from the Commandant of the Marine Corps. You are being restored to active status, effective immediately. The individual responsible for your termination is being investigated for federal crimes. The Pentagon is prepared to offer you immediate reinstatement at any facility of your choosing, with full back pay and restoration of all benefits." Sarah stood. The boots remained on the chair. She picked them up. When she spoke, her voice had changed. The quiet had lifted. What emerged was the voice of someone who had spent 18 months in hibernation and who was now fully, completely awake. "The Mercy General Hospital," she said. "I'm going back." The colonel nodded once. "Yes, ma'am." At 9:37 a.m., Sarah walked back into Mercy General's emergency department. The colonel was beside her. The two Marines flanked them. Every person in the department stopped moving. The stretchers halted mid-roll. The monitors seemed to hum louder. Dr. Sterling was not present. He was in an interrogation room with two federal agents, his hands trembling as he watched them document his attempts to access and alter Sarah's patient records. The evidence was overwhelming. The fraud was clear. The abuse of authority was documented in emails, in billing records, in the testimony of staff members who had finally stopped being afraid. Sterling's lawyer arrived at 10:04 a.m. By 10:22 a.m., Sterling understood the depth of his exposure. By 10:43 a.m., federal agents were placing handcuffs on his wrists with a precision that made the sound click like a bookmark closing on a finished chapter. They walked him out through the emergency department. Past the nurses. Past the staff. Past the families. Past Sarah, who stood at a vital signs monitor, checking a patient's O2 saturation with the same steady hand that had drawn blood from a dying man's chest. She did not look at Sterling as they passed. She did not need to. The look on the faces around him, the understanding that they had all chosen wrong, that they had all believed the wrong person, was more devastating than any expression of satisfaction could have been. At 11:53 a.m., the hospital's board issued a statement. They were establishing new protocols for employee protection. They were launching a comprehensive investigation into billing practices. They were accepting Sarah's reinstatement with full restoration of rank and seniority. And they were asking her to serve as the director of a new emergency trauma unit being established in the hospital's basement level, a unit specifically dedicated to treating active duty service members and veterans. She accepted without hesitation. By 11:53 a.m., she was in scrubs. Different scrubs from the one she had worn before. These scrubs had her rank embroidered on the collar. These scrubs had meaning that extended far beyond Mercy General. A young nurse approached her during her first shift. "Senior Chief? Thank you for showing us." Sarah checked the nurse's badge. "What's your name?" "Jessica." Sarah nodded. "Thank you for not saying anything when everyone else was quiet. That takes courage." Jessica's eyes filled. Sarah turned back to her work. The monitors beeped their steady rhythm. The rain returned, softer now, tapping the windows like applause. She did not think about Sterling being processed through the federal system. She did not think about the 18 months of silence. She did not think about the boots, which now sat on a shelf in her apartment, next to a photograph of a unit she was no longer supposed to acknowledge. The trembling had stopped. What remained was something clearer. Something without weight. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. And now, restraint was no longer necessary. 2 weeks later, a young Marine second lieutenant appeared at her station. He was holding a folder. His name was Mitchell. His eyes carried something she recognized, the particular exhaustion of someone training to do what she had done. "Chief," he said, "the Commandant wanted me to deliver this personally. The task force is requesting your expertise for a new medic training program. Advanced trauma, combat protocols, everything you know." Sarah took the folder. "When do I start?" Mitchell smiled. "Yesterday, You're already overdue." She did not smile back. But something in her expression shifted. Something that had been folded away began to unfold. "You don't need a badge or a gun to be a warrior." Thank you for watching. Subscribe for more stories of quiet strength revealed. Like this video if you believe the best heroes are the ones we overlook. And tell us in the comments, have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value?